I know you have in your booklets the list of translations that I've used for the part of the course so far and the part that's coming. I do just want to mention briefly that the translation I've been reading from and will continue to read from is one by Julia and Peter Bondinella. And although there are other very fine translations, it's the one I prefer, and it's available in a pretty inexpensive copy. Well, remember that Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy divided into three separate sections. Each one is a discourse on Livy, and then they're subdivided into chapters. Up to now, we've been looking at the first discourse. And as Machiavelli often does, we'll see this in the Florentine histories as well, when he gets to a major break in a work, he stops and ponders for a while. And at the beginning of the second discourse, Machiavelli ponders some more about the nature and value of history and how we view the past. And as you know by now, as a historian, I just simply am incapable of resisting talking about what Machiavelli says about how we understand and use history. So in the words of one former president, here we go again, with a little bit of historical analysis on the part of Machiavelli. Machiavelli says there are a lot of people living in his time, and I might add there are in our time, who always praise the past but condemn the present. They are really caught up with a view of the past that says, boy, men were men, women were women back then. I think about the old song that Archie and Edith sang on All in the Family. Girls were girls and men were men. Well, there is always that kind of nostalgia for the past. And as you can imagine, there was a great deal of nostalgia during the Renaissance, which, after all, so focused on the brilliance of the classical world. And Machiavelli wants to warn against this kind of nostalgia because part of that nostalgia is also dismissing the present time. We don't have the geniuses we used to have. It's not like the good old days. Certainly Americans fall into this. How often do we say there just hasn't been anybody along since our forefathers, since the authors of the Constitution, or since Abraham Lincoln, or whatever? We just are in a declined state. There are no great people after those times. Machiavelli warns about that. First of all, he warns us, we don't know everything about the past. That is to say, very often in the way historians wrote and write, we don't necessarily know some of the downsides, some of the lower moments, that we tend to view history, if you will, as a kind of highlights reel. And we don't so much see the stuff in between, while of course we examine our own society, especially in an age of instant communications, every day, 24 hours a day. And he says that people often treat history as if it were, say, a statue. And that's wrong. It's an interesting analogy Machiavelli makes, because he says, you see, when a statue was made in the ancient world, it, at least in principle, can survive and be today exactly what it looked like when it was made. Now, obviously, we know statues are damaged and pieces of bodies are lopped off statues and so on. But in principle, a work of art can survive exactly as it was made and as exactly as it was seen by those who were the original viewers of it. History doesn't work that way. We never see the past exactly as it is. We never have all the facts. We never know all the actors. We never see all the motivations. And because we see our world with all of this detail, we see the good side and the bad side and whatever, we then can draw the conclusion, boy, things were simply better back then. Wow, those really were the good old days. And Machiavelli is very careful in warning us not to become nostalgic about the past. He's a hard-headed guy, and he's a hard-headed guy about the past, and he's also not one of those guys who always wants to defer to the past. Machiavelli goes on to say, for example, that the world has always more or less been in the same state, in the same condition. That ability, genius, if you will, has been distributed throughout history. In fact, he says from the very beginnings of history, which he associates with Assyria, all the way to the present. Not all the smart guys lived in the past. Not all the great men or women lived in the past. That genius, that talent is really distributed rather evenly. And now Machiavelli takes this another step. Just as we tend to say things about ourselves, we are inferior to the past, we tend to reverse that when we look around the world today. What we tend to do in Italy, Machiavelli says, is see people beyond the Alps as inferior, as having nothing to teach us, that we set the standard and the world out there really doesn't have much to say. We need to recognize that there is genius beyond the Alps. We wonder whether Machiavelli knew this as a young man or thought this way as a young man. But as we've seen in the biographical look at Machiavelli, he took diplomatic trips beyond the Alps. He was in France. He was in the Holy Roman Empire in what's now Germany. And no doubt Machiavelli experienced the fact that, boy, folks there are smart too. They may not see things the way I do. We may disagree even. But those are smart folks that I dealt with there, as well as smart folks that I dealt with in Rome or at the court of Cesare Borgia or whoever it might be. And interestingly enough, Machiavelli even sends a sort of warning to another group of people who he said have the same problem, and that's the Greeks. Remember that in 1453, the Turks had conquered the Byzantine Empire. And that included not just much of what's now Turkey, but also part of the Balkans. And Machiavelli suggests that the Greeks just don't recognize that the Turks have genius, that the Turks are smart, that the Turks are civilized. Bad mistake. The Greeks do to the Turks what we tend to do to Transalpine people, Machiavelli said. And again, notice it's still part and parcel of that notion that we have this imbalanced understanding of ourselves in relationship to others, whether those others are in the past or whether those others are beyond the Alps or wherever they might be. And so this is a place where Machiavelli sort of steps back and asks us to think a little bit about how we evaluate the world in which we live in, as well as the world that was in the past, how we evaluate people beyond, and how we evaluate ourselves. One of the things, of course, is we can learn, therefore, Machiavelli suggesting, from anybody. He gives examples in The Prince, for example, of here's something the French did well. He'll also say here's something the French did ill. Here's something the Germans do well. Remember, I used the example of those well-fortified, sort of independent and safe city-states, these city republics in Germany. They really do well because they have their moats and their food and their all those sorts of things. So that Machiavelli is ultimately telling us how we learn in the world, and the answer is we learn from everybody. We don't idealize anybody. We don't trash anybody as simply being, so below us that we have nothing to learn. And so Machiavelli starts out with a reflection on how we analyze history, but he broadens it from there. So we're not just talking about how we analyze history, but it's how we deal with the world around us as well. And in this sort of meditation on history, Machiavelli ends by speculating and wondering whether he has fallen into the very trap that he warns his readers against. He says, now that I think of it, it's not quite that informal, but, now that I think of it, I praise the Roman Republic all the time. Have I set the Roman Republic on too high a pedestal? Have I made it a kind of dream world of ideals that really wasn't? And have I, therefore, by implication, simply said, boy, we are inferior to that world that I look back at through the lens of Livy's history? I think the very fact that Machiavelli speculates about that is interesting. That what we really do see here is, as I pointed out before, this creative mind. Because Machiavelli wants to have the right goals, as we know, and he wants to know what are the means we need to use to achieve those goals. We've talked about that in The Prince. We've talked about that here in the Discourses. And Machiavelli is giving us another way of thinking about how we set correct goals and how we learn to relate means to ends. And it's very interesting that he begins the second discourse with a rather long and interesting pondering of how we learn, not just from the past, but how we learn. Now, let's roll up our sleeves and get down to some of the more specific issues that Machiavelli deals with by looking at Livy's history of Rome. And I think this is a nice way that he begins, given what I've just said. He makes the point that both Livy and the great biographer Plutarch, who was a Greek who lived in the 1st century and early 2nd century AD, that both Livy and Plutarch apparently think, he concludes, that Rome conquered its empire. This is small e, not big E, meaning the empire, the territories that Rome accumulated, not referring to the capital E, empire, as a form of government that comes along at the time of Augustus. So I just want to make sure we know what I mean by empire here. That Rome conquered its empire more by fortune than by skill. That is what I conclude, Machiavelli says, that Plutarch and Livy claim. Well, Machiavelli said, Plutarch and Livy are wrong. Here's one where I think I know what they're saying, and I think what they're saying is wrong. In fact, it was the abilities of the Roman army that led to the growth of Rome's territory. Let's not talk about this being a matter of fortune or good luck. It is not that at all. Rome won its empire because of skill, especially the skill of its army and its army's commanders as well as soldiers. Now, what are some of the specific ways that Rome acted militarily that led to that expansion? Number one, Rome never became involved in two great wars at the same time. Rome understood that the fights they were making were serious fights and that they needed to have a concentration of their forces in order to win. And therefore, to fight two enemies at the same time could have been fatal, even though collectively Rome was stronger than either one of those enemies. And so Rome never fought two major wars at the same time. Secondly, Rome always sought out friends in the territories it was trying to conquer. You don't just go and bust into somebody else's territory saying, we'll just go in and whoop those guys. You find out in those countries that you are seeking to invade and conquer who there is disgruntled, who there is sort of a Romanophile, who might think, or how can we persuade people to think, certain people, that they'd be better off under Roman rule than under the rule they currently have. And so Rome always worked that way. It tried to find friends so that in its attack, and when it was successful, it wasn't simply it's them and us and all of them hate all of us. You don't want to have that situation either when you're attacking or after the war is over and you've won. Now, Machiavelli stops and says, don't get me wrong, fortune played a role in Rome's success. I wouldn't deny that. But, as he does very rarely in the Discourses, he says, if you want to read more about fortune, let me remind you what I said in The Prince. Fortune perhaps controls half of our destiny. But, remember the metaphor he used, fortune is like a river. And you can't stop the rains or the melting snow from swelling the river. What you can do is build dikes and levees and flood control so that when that water comes, you're ready for it and you can deal with it. And therefore, in that sense of fortune, fortune played a role. But it wasn't the deciding role because the Romans always were ready to take advantage of the circumstances that occurred over which they had little or no control. And therefore, we are reminded of the way he ends The Prince, the last major topic in The Prince, before that exhortation to throw the barbarians out of Italy, if you recall, is a discussion of fortuna, of fortune, and defining it in such a way that he sort of skips over the Christian way that fortune had been interpreted and rather goes back to an ancient idea and reshapes it, that fortune is like a river, fortune is like a woman. And remember what else he says in The Prince, and that is that when some event happens over which you have no control, you need to have a certain boldness in dealing with it. That ultimately it's better to be sort of tough and ready and willing to take some risks than it is just to sit back and wait to see how things turn out. Now, Machiavelli takes up the question of the fact that one of the reasons that some wars in the ancient world, not just for the ancient Roman Republic, but in the ancient world, were so tough is because so many people loved liberty so much that the idea of giving up our liberty was something that was so offensive to people that they really would struggle and fight with all their might to the end, sometimes in ugly losing causes. But nevertheless, it says something about that ancient love of liberty. We don't want somebody else calling our shots. And Machiavelli gives a couple interesting examples. One of them comes not from the Roman Republic, but from a story he read in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. It's one of the most graphic and one of the most dramatic of all the stories that's told, although it's a story about neither Athens nor Sparta directly. It's a story of a place called Corcyra, the modern island of Corfu. It's in the northwestern corner of Greece. And what happens there is that a civil war between different factions begins, and one side calls in Athens, the other side calls in Sparta, and the bitterness and anger as each one feared the control of the other faction meant the control of that other superpower city, whether it's the pro-Athenians fearing Spartan control or the pro-Spartans fearing Athenian control, that Thucydides describes the tragedy, the bloodshed, the way that families broke down. It's really, in some ways, the most stark of all the images in Thucydides. And it's something that clearly struck in the mind of Machiavelli as well. Remember that Thucydides had been translated into Latin in the 1420s. So Thucydides was one of those texts that was available, although, again, Machiavelli didn't read Greek, and clearly Livy was sort of his favorite ancient historian. Then Machiavelli turns to a very important question. Why don't people today value liberty? Why don't they have that same passion for liberty that people did back then? And he gives a very interesting answer. It's not about, oh, we're weaker people now. Not that at all. It is that we educate people differently. That education is vitally important. We have different value systems. He doesn't just mean education in the sense of school books, but he means education in the sense that the way people learn from the traditional values of their culture, which of course are still in 16th century Florence, largely religious and therefore largely overtly Christian values. We have different religion and therefore different values, and one of the results of the education or the enculturation of our children into that set of values is we don't value liberty and the kinds of deeds that win and preserve liberty as much as they did back in ancient times. Let me read you a passage from early in the second discourse that deals with this. In considering, therefore, why all the peoples of ancient times were greater lovers of liberty than those of our own day, I believe this arises from the same cause that today makes men less strong, which I believe lies in the difference between our education and that of antiquity, based upon the difference between our religion and that of antiquity. For while our religion has shown us truth and the true path, it also makes us place a lower value on worldly honor, whereas the pagans, who greatly valued honor and considered it the highest good, were more ferocious in their actions. Very interesting. Christianity is a religion, after all, that says stuff like, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. Those who humble themselves on earth will be exalted. Those who exalt themselves will be brought low. Those are all phrases out of Luke's gospel, and they're found in various places in other parts of the New Testament as well. And so Machiavelli says, our religion is true in some ways, although he doesn't define what he means by that. He is certainly a baptized Christian. Presumably he goes at least through the motions of Christianity, as virtually everybody did in Florence at the time that Machiavelli was alive. And I think there's always a way in which Machiavelli believes in the Christian God. But he says, let's face it, some of the teachings of Christianity, some of the ways in which we teach people about what God wants from us are in fact detrimental to a worldview in which people will go out and do great deeds in order to achieve and preserve liberty. Christians always have the out of saying, well, even if things are sort of crummy now, it's only for a while. And if we suffer now, well, blessed are those who suffer. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Because in the eyes of eternity, this is just a dot on the map. And we're going to spend eternity in the presence of God. Machiavelli even, it seemed with a little bit of nostalgia, says, boy, back in the old days, the kind of religious activities, the kind of religious rituals that were performed involved the slaughter of animals and that sort of stuff where you actually saw blood, and that inspired awe. That there was something that was awesome in a way that was transferable to political action that is very different than the awesomeness of the Christian liturgy, where we talk about a piece of bread becoming the body and blood of Christ. And so it may be that you've got a body and you've got blood on the altar, but it looks like bread and wine. What the pagans had on their altar was bodies. They slaughtered them. He isn't thinking so much about human slaughter here. He's thinking about the animal sacrifices that were made. And then Machiavelli goes on with a further comment about the differences between Christianity and pagan religions in the ancient world, and how Christianity has had, some sort of negative effect on this zeal for liberty and this passion for great deed. Beside this, ancient religion beatified only men fully possessed of worldly glory, such as the leaders of armies and the rulers of republics. Our religion has more often glorified humble and contemplative men rather than active ones. Moreover, our religion has defined the supreme good as humility, abjection, and contempt of worldly things. Ancient religion located it in greatness of mind, strength of body, and in all the other things apt to make men the strongest. Very interesting. Because, well, if you've been to Florence or any place in Italy, or really almost any place in the Christian world, you know that when you walk into a church, especially a Catholic church with all of its art, what do you see? Of course, you see Jesus suffering on the cross. And we know that's glorified. Then you start going around the side altars or looking at the frescoes or the stained glass windows, especially if you're north of the Alps. And what do you see? You see men at prayer or women at prayer. You see a contemplative like Benedict or Bernard of Clairvaux celebrated. Men who spent their lives living in caves or monasteries. Women who spent their lives in caves and monasteries. Or you see the great Christian martyrs, the one who meekly subject themselves to torture and death. Lawrence on his gridiron, Stephen by being stoned to death, Catherine being ripped apart by the spikes of a spinning wheel against her body. Those are the images. Machiavelli sees them all the time. We now see them still in those churches in Florence or in museums that have been where the art's been taken out of the churches of Florence. And Machiavelli doesn't say that's wrong, doesn't say those folks aren't heroes in some ultimate way. What he does say is the values that they pass on, a certain kind of passivity, contemplativeness, a certain kind of humility, and sort of not fighting back, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, and so on. Machiavelli says that has an effect on the way people grow up to live their lives, and, well, they see their liberty threatened, and again, it's perhaps, Machiavelli would say, too easy in our society to say, well, shucks, if our liberty goes, that'll be too bad, but it goes, I'm going to heaven. And so Machiavelli is in some ways concerned with how the values of Christianity have made it more difficult for people to struggle for and preserve their liberty. And as we've seen in the first discourse, Machiavelli emphasizes equality and liberty as two basic principles of republics. And of course, we know by now that Machiavelli is indeed a Republican by choice. And so it's very interesting what he says about Christianity. He does not object to its theology. He does not deny that it's theologically true. He doesn't say, that piece of bread on the altar is just a bread. Or he doesn't say, there ain't no heaven, there ain't no hell. Doesn't say any of those things. I think he believes there's a heaven and a hell. I think he believes probably that bread is in some very real way the body and blood of Christ. But the package of Christian teachings are nevertheless inimical to certain principles of statecraft. And this is a book of political science. It's not a book of theology. This is a book where Machiavelli is saying religion here harms what I think should be the right political goals for this society. It's a very interesting set of comments that Machiavelli makes. Now, in this lecture, the last topic I want to look at is exactly how did Rome expand its territory? What were some of the principles it used? What kinds of organizations, what kinds of inclusions did Rome make with the territories that were its neighbors and the territories over which it got control? Machiavelli says there are three essential ways of being able to expand territory. Okay? Number one, the Romans planned for a big city. He's convinced that even when Rome was small, it had plans for a big city, and that's important because, of course, a big city would have a lot of population and would produce a lot of soldiers. Now, let's take a look at some ways where the city of Rome and the Republic operated vis-a-vis the places that it did conquer because, among other things, it had a large army. Number one, he said, you can become part of a confederation. Rome didn't do that, but that's one possible way of doing it. In fact, he says that's what the Etruscans did. We still today talk about the Etruscan Confederation, the 12 major cities of that Etruscan Confederation. He said that's how the Etruscans operated. And by the way, he said that's how the Swiss operate today. All those little Swiss cities or cantons, he says, have some sort of confederation. Switzerland wasn't a country yet, any more than Italy was a country, but nevertheless there was a confederation. The second way to do this is to make alliances, not form a confederation. That implies a kind of equality, but to make alliances, and that's what Rome did. When Rome came next to a territory, it would try to ally with it. When it conquered a territory, it would try to be inclusive of that territory, bring it into the larger Roman state, treating it as an ally, not obliterating its independence and traditions, but treating it as an ally, although certainly one not necessarily always voluntarily an ally. The third way to go about this, he says, is the way that Athens and Sparta did it, and that was to obtain subject states. Athens built what we call the Delian League into the Athenian Empire, where various city-states were essentially forced to have the same foreign policy and forced to send money that became a kind of tribute to Athens. Now, let's look at those three: the confederation model, the alliance model, and the subjection model. Okay? The Roman model was the best. The Athenian and Spartan way was the worst. It didn't work. It's recorded in Thucydides how it didn't work. But Rome's alliance method was the best way to do it, and Rome invented this. This is not something Rome learned from the Greeks, who had been through, after a lot of history by the time that Rome became important. But rather, this was a Roman invention, the alliance method. Now, Machiavelli takes that and says, today, that method, which worked so well for Rome, is totally ignored. Now, again, we know that Machiavelli is the first to say you can't just take an idea and plant it into a new culture. But this is a place where Machiavelli thinks that, in fact, this Roman practice would make good sense in his own day. And yet, the people of his own day, the leaders of his own day in Florence and other places, have totally rejected it. Secondly, he said, if we can't get people to do that, or if that's not feasible, at least people today ought to try the Etruscan method. Build, that is to say, a series of states coming together in a kind of confederation. There are different ways to expand, and we need to look at them historically and today. Some are good, some are bad. I'm not one of these guys that Xeroxes the past and says this is the way to do things in the present. But in this case, I say, if we look at the three, we discover that the best is the Romans, and we ignore it completely. The second best is the Etruscans, and some modern states, some modern people do that, like the Swiss. And there's the third method that never works. That's the Athenian-Spartan method, and that's the method that seems to be most popular in Italy today. We need to fix that.